Welcome back to Neon Liberalism. I'm Samantha Hancoxley. And this week, I want to talk about something that I think has been in the news a lot lately and that I think a lot of people have found very disturbing, which is the military presence on our streets under President Trump, the increasing use of the military for political purposes, or the threat of the use of the military for political purposes. And to talk about that, I thought I would have on probably the perfect person to talk about this. Kori Schake from you run the Foreign and Defense Policy team at the American Enterprise Institute, and the author of The State and the Soldier, a book about the history and theory of civil military relations in America. So yeah, Kori, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I guess first question, what are civil military relations and why do they matter?
So, the term is about the relationship between the American public, and my book focuses particularly on the leadership in the American public and the military force we train, recruit, equip, and pay for to do violence on behalf of the state. In the American context, that has been predominantly external since at least the consolidation of the continental United States with the end of the Indian Wars and the Mexican War and the Civil War.
Okay. Um, and I think a lot of Americans, for example, growing up, I really took this for granted, right? This said, like the place of the military in the American life, or in our society. And I think your book kind of suggests we shouldn't take that for granted, that it's kind of contingent, that there have been in history many other ways of like relating between the society and its military. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what's distinctive about the American tradition and like why does that matter?
Oh, absolutely. Um, because what is almost unique in the American experience is that we are a country founded in fear of a standing army and challenge the state's ability to have a standing army, right? 13 of the 85 Federalist Papers are, are James Madison and Alexander Hamilton trying to persuade the American public that we need to have a military for protection of the American population. That wasn't a given in the American experience. And so it is anomalous that we come to have a military that most Americans consider a major force for democracy in our country. And because they haven't had to fear the domestic use of the American military for political repression, it's an incredibly popular institution. And that's why the Trump administration's domestic deployments for law enforcement purposes or just to try and look tough in American cities is so incredibly damaging, not just to the military itself, but to the American public's belief in our military as a positive actor on the American political scene.
Yeah, no, I absolutely want to talk about what Trump is doing and like why it's dangerous. And I think, we can kind of look at history a little bit to understand why it's so dangerous, right? Like there's this old joke about Prussia, right? That Prussia was an army with a country, um, right? That Napoleon, famously when he's being crowned emperor of France, he has this line that he saw a crown in the gutter and picked it up with a sword. And at one time or another, a lot of ambitious military men have seen a crown in the gutter and reached out to pick it up, right? In a lot of countries, right, the relation between the state, between society, and the military has been very fraught, let's say, been very adversarial because it's dangerous, right? A military is like inherently it's supposed to be dangerous. Like that's kind of the whole point of it. But that for a lot of countries, like that's not just a danger you point at other people. It's maybe a danger that starts to get pointed at you. And in the American context, that hasn't happened very often. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about like that, or like how
Oh,
we
I'd
got here,
love
or how does
to.
any of that work?
I'd love to. This is my favorite part of the book because you would have a very different relationship between the American public and its military if George Washington wasn't the foundation stone on which that relationship is built. And Washington does set several important precedents, but the one I want to emphasize most is about the subordination of the military to elected civilian leadership. You know, even in the worst days of the American Revolution, George Washington never demands of Congress. He pleads, he entreats, he tries to educate, but he always understands that the civilians get the right to determine the strategy, the resources, and the policies that affect the American military. And the most glittering moment when this shines through is in 1783. So it's 2 years after Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown. But the British military was still in possession of Manhattan. And so Washington's army was camped upstream along the Hudson River at a place called Newburgh. And the soldiers were restive, right? They're 2 years encampment. They haven't been paid. They haven't been fed. They were promised at their enlistments lifetime pensions, which several of the newly independent American states then made illegal. Washington had to hang 2 soldiers for mutinying over lack of food. And Alexander Hamilton at that time was in the Continental Congress, and along with Robert Morris, the guy whose role is roughly equivalent to the Secretary of the Treasury now, they were trying to persuade the Continental Congress to vote itself revenue raising powers. The only way the federal government had any money was, ironically enough, tariffs. And so Hamilton and Morris come up with this idea that Washington's army should march on Congress in Philadelphia and demand to be paid, because then Congress would have to vote itself revenue raising powers, right? I love the expression on your face right now because that's exactly the appropriate response of democratic peoples, which is Alexander Hamilton has a lot of dangerous ideas. So Hamilton writes Washington, right, for all intents and purposes, his godfather, and says, "Hey, boss, I've got a great idea. How about you march the army and threaten the Congress?" Washington refuses, saying an army is a very dangerous instrument to play with. And then he gathers his officers together. He stations 6'6", 240-pound Major General Henry Knox at the door to take into custody for court-martialing any officer who won't sign an oath of allegiance to the Continental Congress. And then he does one more wonderful thing, which is he acknowledges Congress is terrible at their job, but says that is not the basis of our subordination. Congress doesn't have to earn the right of control over the American military, because Washington wanted the American army to be the first in 1,000 years that wasn't a threat to democracy. And that precedent is what I think still colors the professionalism of the American military. In the 19th century in particular, you get lots of charismatic, successful military officers who run for president, who think they're smarter than the elected politicians, but none of them have a military following willing to sign up for this undertaking. And I think that's George Washington's legacy.
I think that's absolutely right. I think growing up, it's kind of easy to, in some ways, take Washington for granted or like forget about him as a founding father, right? His name's on everything, right? He's the first president, but he doesn't write the Federalist Papers, right? He's not famous for being a great intellect or a constitutional theorist. And so it like can be kind of a mystery, like looking back, like why were all the other founding fathers like so enamored with this guy? And I think some of it comes back to honestly virtue, right? That he had a certain like very few people in history have stood where he was standing, right, with a crown within reach and could resist reaching out for it. And he did, right? He didn't actually want to be king, and we're all the better for it.
So actually, George III is on the record on this very subject because when the King of England was told that George Washington was voluntarily stepping aside from running the United States at the end of his second term, George III said, if that's true, he's history's greatest man. Because it was so anomalous that anyone would lay aside power to govern. Uh, yeah, Washington's amazing. And, I love your list of things he didn't do. And I would add to it, George Washington is actually not a very good general, right? He's responsible for the massacre at Jumonville. He has to surrender forts to the French. He nearly gets his unit wiped out at Monongahela. And actually, when he's in command of the Revolutionary Army, he keeps writing plans for a decisive battle with the British, right? He tries it 3 times. He nearly gets wiped out. And he only gets saved in the Battle of Brooklyn Heights because Nathaniel Greene's smart enough to haul the cannon up the Palisades and skedaddle. But what Washington's great at, he's a great leader, right? He identifies all these young sparklers, Daniel Morgan, Nathaniel Greene, the Marquis de Lafayette, Alexander Hamilton, and gives them essentially mission command, right? They know what needs doing, and they set aside Washington's plans and just figure out a way to get it done. And Washington eventually concedes to a Jacobin strategy, right? As long as you have an army in the field, you have a rebellion. But he refuses initially because he considers it, he actually describes it as a lesser form of cowardice. But he lets himself get pushed into it because he's got no better option.
Yeah, I think that's very important. A while back now, I had Brett Devereaux on the podcast talking about Sulla in Rome, and he said, yeah,
Oh, I hate
Sulla
Sulla.
Sulla could never erase his example, right? That he proved you could take an army and march on Rome and rewrite the Constitution. And like, if Alexander Hamilton says, no, you can take an army and march on Philadelphia, and only once, though, only once. And it's like, you can't do it just once, right? Once you open that door, every ambitious general is going to be looking at it, wondering if they can squeak through as well.
Absolutely. It's Pandora's box. As soon as you open the top, you can't put anything back in it.
That's right. And in moving on a little bit from Washington, like his example's been pretty enduring, right? We haven't really had that kind of challenge to civilian leadership, as far as I know. I mean, so I'm kind of curious, like, what would you say, like, how is the concept of, military subordination to the civilian, like, evolved and, like, maybe been challenged since Washington?
Yeah. So the way it's been challenged in, I think, 2 important ways in modernity. But let me start by saying that one of the things the founding fathers had wrong is that they worried that a standing army would become a threat to governance. And the reverse actually happens. It's in times of war where you have the largest standing armies, that you have the most intimate and supportive civil military relations, right? Washington with the Continental Congress in the Revolutionary War, Abraham Lincoln with Grant, Porter, Sherman, Sheridan in the American Civil War. Now he has to fire 3 leaders of the army to get there, but the system works as designed. In World War II, I mean, the Joint Chiefs, objected to a Europe first strategy throughout the war, but they carried it out uncomplainingly because Franklin Roosevelt was the guy who gets to decide. And so in times of the greatest national effort put into military operations is when the system has worked best. But contemporaneously, there are 2 enormous, well, I guess 3 pressures that are challenging the system. The first is the way the American public continues to have enormous respect for its military when it has lost respect for virtually every other institution in American life, in houses of worship, communities of worship, in the legislature, in the courts, in the presidency. And so it creates an enormous incentive for politicians to hide behind the military, right? For George W. Bush to send Dave Petraeus up to Capitol Hill to defend the surge in Iraq, for presidents to feel like the military is trying to box them in, which Obama believed over Afghanistan, Trump believed over Afghanistan, Biden believed over Afghanistan. So that's one thing, right? And it pretty much comes into being after the 1991 Gulf War, is when that phenomenon really begins. The collapse of public admiration and trust in other institutions, while trust for the military remains high. The second source of friction is the polarization in American politics. Because even though the military is well insulated against partisanship by culture, by law, nonetheless, a military that's drawn from broader society is not going to remain separate from the political forces in that society forever. And there is so much public pressure. The public wants the military engaged in every dumb argument we are having. But interestingly, there's a lot of research, particularly by Peter Feaver and Heidi Urban on this, that like retired high-ranking officers' political endorsements, they don't change on our military remaining out of politics, is the outrageousness with which President Trump and his supporters are attempting to politicize the military. Pardoning people who were convicted in courts martial, appointing to high-ranking Defense Department civilian positions people who were drummed out of military service for insubordination or politicization, giving political rally speeches in front of uniformed audiences, firing for no reason every woman in the senior command, practically every minority in the senior command, and everybody who had any association with either former military leaders like General Milley or had served as a uniformed officer on the NSC, and all of those things. It's really bad. And it's
Yes, no, I
really
mean,
dangerous.
I I absolutely want to talk about the purges. I mean, it actually frustrates me how few people are like how little the mainstream media has actually covered like the effective purge of senior leadership on what seem to be pretty transparently like gender and racial grounds. Like that's pretty disturbing. I just want to flag that, but I want to ask you a different question first, though, which is you've talked a little bit about this idea that, well, trust in all these other institutions is declining, but the military is separate, right? The military isn't political, right? It's kind of like subordinate to the civilian world, but it's not really part of civilian politics in some way. And the theory behind this, as far as I understand it, is kind of why your book is called what it is, right? Samuel Huntington's book, the Soldier and the State, which is kind of, in my understanding, you may correct me on this, kind of like the Bible for many American officers when it comes to understanding their place in
Absolutely.
society. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like that book and that theory and like how it became so central to the American military's self-conception.
Sure. So let me say right at the start, I hate Sam Huntington's book. I I'm outraged that it is the foundation of the study of civil military relations in the US. So you don't really have scholarship on the subject until after World War II, because you don't really have a substantial standing American military in peacetime until after World War II. So the reason Huntington is the Bible is because he's the first to have a serious academic study of the American military. Um, Moreover, his theory is one that the military finds incredibly attractive. Because what Huntington argues is that the military should be stovepiped and separate from political influence all the way up to the very top, right? And that politicians should leave the military a unique and hermetically sealed professionalism and should be widely deferential to their military judgment. And that was a popular idea, and you can see why it's attractive to the military, right? Because it's extraordinarily deferential, that their experience gives them judgment unique in the ecosystem of politics and therefore to be deferred to. And that goes out of fashion certainly by the time of the Vietnam War, but even before that, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Because the military is making recommendations for, fighting the
Equation.
Soviet Union that are so far out of bounds of what President Kennedy and the political leadership are trying to do, that they just get literally left out of the meetings. And you also see it in the Vietnam War, um, where, the military's plans for this are so far out of sync with what President Johnson and Secretary McNamara are willing to do. There's this great moment in the McNamara Pentagon where it's in a debate over nuclear targeting. And one of the uniformed military is condescending to the civilians, like Alan Entoven, over, you don't have the kind of experience that trains your judgment. And Entoven wheels around and says, I fought just as many nuclear wars as you have, General. And so, kind of the second great book of the canon of civil military relations is Morris Janowitz's The Professional Soldier. And he's sort of the flip side of the coin from Huntington. And Janowitz says, look, we need a military that doesn't view itself as unique and insulated from politics. And both Huntington and Janowitz, Huntington's writing in the aftermath of Task Force Smith's failure in the Korean War. Janowitz is writing during the Vietnam War. And both of them are really books of the moment. And both of them import their political preferences into the description. Janowitz is much more serious scholarship. Let me just tell you three things I hate about Sam Huntington's book and why this should be read with a very critical eye. The first is he genuinely thinks, he argues in the concluding chapter of the book that an effective military is incompatible with democracy in America, and democracy in America needs to change. Right? That's outrageous. The second reason that Huntington is outrageous is that he believes there is a military mind, right? That everybody in the military has the same politics and the same views on subjects. And that wasn't true. I mean, anybody who's read Joseph Heller writing about his World War II experiences knows that that's not true. But we have an enormous amount of data on this subject by now. And if you normalize for education level and income, the American military's attitudes aren't any different from the American public writ large. So there's not one military mind. There are millions of American military minds. And the third reason I hate Huntington is because he smuggles his political preferences into his scholarship. He acts like it's scholarship, but it's politics, and that's cheating.
Yeah, I find the Huntingtonian picture, like, I can understand why it's attractive, like, on a narrative level. Like, I read books where I read military science fiction, where, characters will turn to the camera and basically say, look, there's peace, and you peaceful people can do all your peaceful things, but, like, war demands its own kind of mindset. And you should keep politics out of war. It's only going to make us worse at war. If we have any politics in war, it's its own, like, pure martial calling. I can see you're already shaking your head. So, uh,
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the best contemporary scholarship and policy reflections on this subject, Sir Lawrence Friedman, Eliot Cohen, repudiate that notion that you can't have the idea that you can have strategy that's effective, that is innocent of politics, is just not true, right? And so the you can't have a military providing advice that's not responsive. I mean, you can have it, but it's bad military advice if it's not responsive to the political constraints. And if the politicians don't understand what military force cannot achieve for you, then they're going to make bad strategy. The person who is most resonant on this is George Marshall, right? Chief of Staff of the Army during World War II. And Marshall said over and over again that there wasn't a single choice he made as Chief of Staff of the Army that wasn't informed by politics. Because, the President of the United States is the only person who understands the trade offs of what you are providing for the war effort. And so the Marshall Rule is defer to the politicians because they're the people the American public can hold accountable for these choices.
no, I think that's right. Like, there's a point. B.A. Friedman, in his book on
I
operations,
love that book.
it's a good book. Um, but he argues, right, that, like, the American military has kind of become obsessed with operational thinking at the expense of strategic thinking. Right? It's all these questions of, well, how do we effectively move armies around and deploy violence? And we just leave all that strategic thinking to the politicians, and this has been kind of dysfunctional. Um, Right, like, there's an example I really like from U.S. Grant's memoirs, where he's talking about planning the Vicksburg campaign, and he says, I'm over here, and Vicksburg is over here on the other side of this huge river, And the easiest way to get there would just be to march upriver, cross over in Union territory, and then march back down. But that would have been perceived by the public as a retreat. And that would have been very bad for the war effort. And so I actually have to like march downriver, cross over at a different point, cut my supply lines, fight through rebel territory, fight off multiple armies, and then invest Vicksburg. And it works, because brilliant campaign. Um, right, but that just shows that he's right that political considerations, like what is the goal of this war effort, like that is ultimately a political question. What are we trying to do here? And that is always
Absolutely.
going to inform like how you do things. So I think that like there's
Yeah,
this
it should be
fantasy of
a really
separation.
basic point, right? But it gets lost. And the over reliance on Huntington is one of the reasons it gets lost. Huntington actually thought that civil military relations were in crisis in World War II because the military leadership didn't insist that after Nazi Germany and Japan were forced to capitulate, we didn't turn and fight the Soviet Union, our wartime ally. He thought that was the essential advice that the military should have forced the president to take. That's just wrong at so many levels and just
That's
shows
definitely
how much isolating the military from political considerations creates that kind of dumb strategy.
Yeah, that definitely feels like importing your politics into your analysis, like ever so slightly. Um,
Can
so I'm
I can I talk about Ulysses Grant though?
yeah, go right ahead.
Because I share your admiration for Grant, and I think no military officer in American history has ever had it as difficult as Ulysses Grant does in 1866 and 1867 during the constitutional crisis. And with your permission, can I extol Grant's amazing judgment?
I'm never going to stop anyone from extolling Ulysses S. Grant, so go right ahead.
So he does two things that are really consequential precedents during the constitutional crisis. So in 1866, so after Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson becomes president. He's basically willing to reconstruct the political, economic, and social antebellum order in the South. And the military is still in occupation of the 14 formerly seceded states and governing them. And so the War Department, which was the Department of the Army in those days, is enormously influential and is carrying out Secretary Stanton's orders that are contrary to what the president wants to do. And the president tries to send General Grant out of the country. Grant's the most popular figure in American political life at this point. Tries to send him to Mexico for, months on end to get him out of the political debate. And Grant refuses to go. And it becomes a major issue at a cabinet meeting. Johnson orders Grant to go to Mexico as part of a peace negotiation. Grant refuses, and the Attorney General supports Grant's argument that the president has no authority to give the American military non-military orders. And the Attorney General promptly gets fired for this. But the precedent is that, the commander in chief only has latitude to give the military orders that are about military issues, not more broadly. And the second, even more consequential precedent is in 1867, when Congress has impeached the president and is threatening to have him arrested. The president is threatening to disband Congress and have individual members arrested. Congress has passed the three reconciliation pieces of legislation. The president vetoed all three of them. Congress overrode all three vetoes. Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments over the president's objections. Congress passes a law saying the president cannot fire either the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, or General Grant. The president fires Secretary Stanton and tries to appoint Grant, both the senior military officer and the senior civilian in the Department of Defense. Congress threatens Grant with 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine if he accepts the civilian appointment while on active duty. And so Grant has to essentially adjudicate the constitutionality of the two authorized sources of civilian control over the military. And I think it's incredibly consequential that Grant determines in peacetime, Congress has the superior authority over the commander in chief with regards to the American military.
I think that's right, and that's important. And in some ways, it brings us back to Janowitz and this idea of subjective control, right? That you don't want an order of warrior monks who are just like very loyal to like the president specifically, but you want, the political principles of like democracy and the rule of law to kind of permeate the whole structure, right? You want people in the military who are committed to the constitutional project. And I think this is a pretty good case study in why.
I used to have a fabulous example that I would use when teaching civil military relations about the acknowledgement that institutional leaders are fundamentally politicians, right? You are shaping the culture, you're setting the boundaries, you are creating a vision, you're enforcing rules and regulations. And the example I used to use, unfortunately, is now now doesn't hold. But let me tell you the example, and then I'll tell you why it doesn't hold. So the example was that when Elmo Zumwalt was the chief of naval operations during the Vietnam War, he promoted the first female admiral. And as he told the story, when he put her epaulets on her shoulder, he leaned over and kissed her on the cheek. And he writes that he got more hate mail about that than anything else he did as the chief of naval operations. And he responded to that criticism by saying, "You have no idea how many cheeks I had to kiss to become the chief of naval operations. And this was the first time it was a pleasure." And I love that example, but it is unfortunately not true because my amazing research assistant, Caleb Dixon, found a picture of that promotion ceremony. And Zumwalt is trying to spin the historical record because in actuality, he did not kiss her on the cheek. He full on kissed her on the mouth. Ugh. Not only does it ruin the story, it's a terrible example.
Yeah, that's a little grody, I guess I would say.
Yeah, so I can't use that example anymore. But you're right. Leaders of institutions are fundamentally political figures. What we don't want our military to be is either active politicians or partisan political actors. So George Washington was a great general in the Revolution because he had been for 7 years in the Virginia House of Burgesses. He understood politics. He understood where the military fit in the political equation. And that is by itself a political judgment.
Yeah, I find these kind of questions of institutional design very interesting. There's a book I really like by Joseph Heath called The Machinery of Government, and he's
Oh, I
talking
don't
about
know.
this. It's not really about the military, but I think there are some surprising overlaps here. Because he's asking, well, how do you get an efficient civil service, right? How do you get a civil service that is actually good at its job and like produces the outcomes that people want. And for him, one of the dilemmas is that elected politicians often don't really know as much about the subject area as these long-standing civil servants who have a lot more professional knowledge and like understand like the law and the institution and how to get things done. And so they can often like run a snow job on the people who are supposedly, supposed to govern them. And to me, this is really like one of the deepest problems with the Huntingtonian model, right? Is like, how are you supposed to run a military if you don't know anything about a military, right? How are you supposed to have to make, like you said earlier, like how can a civilian make an effective strategic judgment if they don't really understand the military? And so you have to have some level of like interplay and intermingling at the top levels between civilians who have military understanding and military officers who have some political understanding of what's trying to happen. And I just don't think that the total separation model is really tenable.
I think you're exactly right. And and Huntington nowhere in 400 some pages of the book, nowhere does he address what is historically the biggest problem in civil military relations, which is Praetorianism, a military coming to think of itself as different and better than the society it's protecting and taking over the political process, right? I mean, if the military is that separate, then it's a very short path to Praetorianism. And if you have a political leadership wholly ignorant of the military, first of all, they tend to be much too deferential. But second of all, they don't see the signs coming of a military that begins to view itself as, you know, um, soldiers at a bacchanalia of of society.
No, I think that's right. And I think that kind of brings us back to where we are today and maybe some of the tensions we're starting to see in the civil military relationship. Um, right. And to me, like one of like I mean, there's a lot to talk about, but some of the most visible ones has just been the deliberate deployment of American troops in American cities, right? The calling up of the National Guard to address like made up crises in Chicago or in Portland or in DC. I was in DC and I saw National Guard troops stationed around. And this seems genuinely like new. Like this is not something I'd seen before in my lifetime. So I'm curious, like, what your analysis of like what's going on here and why is it dangerous?
Yeah. So let me start with the legal framework. No, actually, let me start culturally. One of the reasons the American public loves the American military is because the only time they're around is when they are rescuing your cat in a flood, helping fight wildfires, putting down riots when there is legitimate concern for the public safety, and police or federal law enforcement are overwhelmed, right? The American public hasn't had to fear the American military. And that's really important in the cultural symbiosis between our public and our military. It's important for recruitment, it's important for retention, it's important for the acceptability of, of military pay raises and the use of military force. So that's going to come under enormous amount of pressure if the American military continues to be deployed in civic spaces. The National Guard has an internal study that polls both National Guard forces who've been deployed to Washington, D.C., and the citizens of Washington, D.C. about the military and their presence. And the military doesn't like doing it, and the public doesn't like them doing it, right? And so it's going to have an effect both on how our military views society and how society views our military. So the legal framework for the use of military forces domestically, there are two pieces of legislation, and they're both intended to restrict the president's authority. The first is the 1807 Insurrection Act. And that law, that bundle of laws that we call the Insurrection Act, says that the president can only use military forces domestically if the country's being invaded or if there is a rebellion that federal forces can't otherwise contain. So the lawsuits that that California, Oregon, and Illinois are raising about the domestic deployments are that the president only has the authority to do what the president has done if he invokes the Insurrection Act. And the president has not done that. The second piece of legislation that restricts presidential authority for the domestic use of military forces is the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act. And this was put into law at the end of military occupation of the formerly seceded southern states. And what the Posse Comitatus Act says is that the American military cannot be involved in law enforcement in the United States except under three conditions. One is if the president invokes the Insurrection Act, in which case he has the authority. Second, a governor requests that assistance from the president. Or third, Congress passes legislation authorizing it. So very tight restrictions, unless the president invokes the Insurrection Act. And so those cases are perking through the courts now. I think the expectation is within the next 2 weeks, we will probably have a Supreme Court decision on the legality of those deployments. Lower courts have restricted them, but you know there's very wide deference by the courts historically to the president's authority to determine whether an insurrection is taking place or whether federal law enforcement is overwhelmed.
So I also have a question about federal law enforcement, right? Because on a notional level, there's this sharp distinction. There's the military, there's federal law enforcement. They're very different agencies, and whatever, they are different agencies. But also, it's hard not to look at what's happening and say, well, those are a bunch of guys, and they're all wearing camouflage and body armor and carrying assault rifles, and maybe the badge says DHS or it says, CBP or it says ICE or it says something, but they look a lot like soldiers. They look a lot like soldiers and they seem to act a lot like soldiers. So where's the line, right, when it comes to like this fear of standing armies, the fear of the military, between the formal military and federal agencies that kind of look and maybe act like a military?
Yeah. So part of the militarization of law enforcement has been to associate itself with the positive public support for the military. And the Defense Department, until quite recently, has been trying to create a bright, clear line between policing functions and military functions, precisely because they don't want to be associated with sharp-edged, unpopular policies, right? Because they understand that this is blurring the line in order to hide behind the popularity of the American military. So, for example, when Mark Esper was Secretary of Defense, he cut off the cascading of any excess military equipment to federal law enforcement or to local law enforcement. But I think what you see in the Trump administration is an active effort to blur that line, right? That the Secretary of Defense is volunteering military officers as judges in immigration cases. He is you probably saw the memo that the Secretary of Defense wrote to the Secretary of Homeland Security offering military forces for DHS roles. I think the Trump administration just takes a very different view and wants the military associated with a lot of domestic law enforcement.
Oh, I think that's exactly right. I think, like you say, they kind of hope the prestige of the military will rub off on them. But I think in practice, people have reacted pretty badly to it, right? They don't like this imagery of pseudo military men rappelling off a Black Hawk into some apartment building in Chicago or whatever, storming through cities and knocking down doors and generally acting kind of like an invading army, right? We don't actually like it when armies invade our own country. Seems kind of bad, actually. Sorry,
A
go ahead.
big reason that the Constitution couldn't be ratified without the Second Amendment was precisely public fear and state governors' fears that the federal government would use military forces repressively and in ways that were contrary to public desires.
Yeah, so there's this whole domestic side of things going on, and at the same time, we're also seeing, the Caribbean boat strike program, the Venezuelan boat strike, whatever they're calling it these days, where basically we have the military doing um, strikes against various vessels in the Caribbean. I think at this point there are about 80 people who have been killed that way. Um, and what I think is kind of striking about this is there's been some questions, right, about are these legal orders, right? Is this according to the laws of war? Apparently, there's some Office of Legal Counsel memo that's circulating in private that says, yes, this is totally fine. But we've also had Democratic members of Congress recently recorded a video saying, to American service members, remember, you don't have to obey illegal orders, right? You do not have to obey illegal orders. And now Trump has reacted to this, and I'm gonna read out his little Truth Social post here because it's a little deranged. He says, all caps, seditious behavior punishable by death, all caps, exclamation mark. And he's talking about Democratic members of Congress here. Um, so I think that there is
Yeah.
it's hard to
So,
separate some of these foreign goings on from these domestic escalations. So I'm curious what your perspective is on these events.
yeah. So let's disentangle it into two separate issues. The first is the legality of the strikes in the Caribbean and off the Pacific coast. Um, because I think the public should have confidence that if the military believed these strikes were illegal, they wouldn't be carrying them out. There's a second question, though, of who gets to decide whether they're legal. You probably saw that just today, the Southern Command's Judge Advocate General's ruling raised a lot of questions internal to the military about the legality of the strikes. So, but the Secretary of Defense's office overruled that, and the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department overruled it. What it feels like to me is emerging is the dynamic that we saw with the so-called torture memos after 9/11, where the military had a lot of concerns, but civilian control of the military is civilian control of the military. And if the Secretary of Defense's lawyer comes to a different conclusion, that's the controlling legal authority. Um, so, uh, so I don't believe the military would be carrying out if they believed these orders were illegal. But we're going to litigate the politics of who's deciding. And that's how it's supposed to work, right? What you should want in contested legal in contested political moments, you want the military to be inert. You don't want them to be a part of the political process. And that's what takes us to the second part, which is I actually feel pretty uncomfortable about the video that the Democratic politicians recorded because I think it is further pulling the military into the political fracas. And now anybody who says, I don't think these orders are legal, will be perceived as acting politically, not as acting legally. And of course, the president threatening political violence is incredibly dangerous and, in my judgment, profoundly un-American. It's a dangerous thing for the president to be doing, and he shouldn't do it.
Yeah, I think that there's at least some stuff in there that I think is very plausible. Something you've talked about in your book, right, is the right to be wrong. Um, right, that like, yeah, sometimes maybe the civilian command is going to issue some orders that are bad. Maybe they're going to issue some orders that are like actually quite wicked. But you don't necessarily want military officers making that determination, right?
Absolutely. They're not qualified to make that decision, right? Every military commander's got a lawyer at their elbow that they turn and ask, can I do this? And if the answer is yes, they do it. If the answer is no, they don't do it. But what I think a lot of people concerned about the choices, in particular on the Caribbean strikes, are overlooking is that a lot of times these legal issues aren't clearly black and white, and that it's responsible for a military lawyer to say, I've got some concerns about this, but that doesn't mean it's illegal. It means we're in that middle space where it's going to be a political judgment. Um,
The thing that I worry about here though is, that we are possibly arguably we're in an escalatory situation. We're in a situation where, like you talked about, like the partisan politics of America leave both sides kind of wanting to pull the military in one direction or another. And I think a lot of people have the fear that Trump didn't leave the White House willingly the first time, and he might not want to leave it willingly again. And that he might try to pull the military into that situation. And maybe in the future, we're going to see a military commander with a much starker choice between, obeying the president and upholding the Constitution. And I'm wondering what you think about that possibility for our country.
yeah, I too am very worried about that. I think the way the president is trying to pull the military, trying to politicize the military, trying to encourage the American public to view the military as a partisan political actor is actually genuinely dangerous. And so I wish the president would stop doing it. I think it's bad for democracy in America that he's doing it. And I am genuinely fearful of things like deploying the military to polling places during elections in ways that might intimidate voters. I, I think those are causes for concern. What is preventing that at the moment is this starchy professionalism of the American military itself. And I really hope it holds because we're putting it under, again, pressure I think we haven't seen the magnitude and type of since the constitutional crisis in 1867. So I think we're right to be concerned about it. I think so far its whole professionalism is holding, but again, it's not just pressure from President Trump and his supporters. There is pressure on the military to be virtuously involved as well, right? That there are a lot of people arguing that the military should determine what are democracy corroding orders and refuse to obey them. And again, I'm sympathetic to the inclination, but I don't see how military officers are equipped to make that kind of judgment. And by the way, if you are going to put the military in the position of their judgment being superior to the civilians we elect to high office, that too is incredibly dangerous in a free society. So, on both the right and the left, people are trying to pull the military in to political adjudication. And the military cannot save us from the political leaders we elect, my friends. Inertness is what you should be hoping for.
So, I mean, I think this is an interesting tension, right? Because on the one hand, like you've rejected the Huntingtonian model of like pure professionalism. We've talked about like, there's always going to be some political considerations. But at the same time, when we're confronted with these great political questions, we're like, maybe we really don't want the military involved in that. And to me, I think this is like I think where this comes from, or the resolution here is that it's often people often talk about like civil military relations as if it's just a question internal to the military itself, that what we study is the military and we just need to answer some institutional questions about the design from a purely internal perspective. But the whole thing about a relation is that there are two parties in a relation, and right, you can't really necessarily have healthy civil military relations unless you also have a relatively healthy civil society. Um,
Absolutely right. And there is a tendency, because we can regulate and control the military, to try and make the solution to the problems fine tuning the military's behavior. And that is not the solution to our current malaise. The bad behavior of our politicians is what is creating this crisis. And civil society and elections and shaming your members of Congress, though the solutions to the problems we have in civil military relations are fundamentally civilian in nature. And that's how the American system was designed. The military can't fix this. We civilians have to fix this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned, the Praetorian tendency earlier, and the name comes from Rome, but there are 20th century examples, right? Turkey for a long time had a Praetorian military, which they thought the government, strayed too far from the path of Ataturk. They just show up and remove the government, and then make their pilgrimage to the tomb of Ataturk and set up a new government. And I don't think
Right.
that's really what we want here. Um,
Absolutely. I mean, the American military diverges from the Prussian military with George Washington, right? That our military is subordinate to civilians. And so if you don't like what's happening, change the civilians,
yeah,
because
well, we're working
the
on it.
military's doing their part of this.
Yeah, and I guess we're running a little bit over time, but I mean, it's a very interesting, maybe important topic. So I kind of want to bring this back to something we talked about at the beginning, which is purges, right? Which is the extent to which Trump seems to be deliberately trying to reshape the top leadership in a direction that seems very much to be based on race, gender, and politics. So I'm curious if you have thoughts about like where that's going and maybe what we can do about it.
So I think there are only two fundamental tests for the health of civil military relations in the US. And the first is, can the president fire any military leader they want? And that's clearly holding, right? The president's fired 17 and 4 star officers already. And the second test is, will the military carry out policies they don't agree with? And I think the historical record's quite strong on that, including in the last 10 years. So I don't think we need to be worried about the fundamental health of civil military relations. I also think you could fire the top 1,000 leaders of the American military and they'd still be good at the job, right? Um, but what the president is doing is squandering an enormous amount of high priced talent that we taxpayers have paid to create. Um, and it is causing an enormous amount of consternation within the senior leadership of the military because the administration's not explaining themselves for why they're firing these people. So it looks a lot like political race and gender um, driving the firings. And that's not a good thing. It will affect how talent chooses to join or stay in the military if they do not see a path to the top for themselves, right? So having the authority to do it doesn't make it right to do. And I think what the president and the secretary of defense are doing is actually quite damaging. Um, the second thing I would say about it is that, uh, you know, you're not going to want a military that is just full of Pete Hegseth clones. Because while physical strength is an important contribution, particularly if you're in the infantry, it's a lot less valuable to the people who are protecting your cyber networks. And it's a lot less valuable to the nerds who you want to have PhDs and think seriously about strategies of effective warfighting. So it's important for one part, and that's the only part that the Secretary of Defense is is encouraging emulation of. And if if the high school jocks are the only people we're bringing in the military, we're going to have a dumber, less successful military.
I think that's absolutely true. Um, I really do take your point about you could probably fire the top 1,000 generals in the army, or excuse me, in the whole department, and the military. We'd lose a lot of talent. It would be very chaotic, but we'd kind of wind up with the same ethos of subordination to the civil authority.
Dep- Depending on who they appoint into the positions that have been vacated. And so far, that's something I've been watching very closely. And so far, the replacements are actually consistent with the professionalism we expect of the American military. That may not hold going forward, but so far, that is holding.
Yeah, and I think I mean, if anything is reassuring in these times, that's reassuring. I kind of want to ask you, like, how do we put Humpty Dumpty back together again, right, in the future? Like, what would be a better policy or a better way of doing a lot of these things? We would be here for another 2 or 3 hours talking about that if I asked you that question. Um, so this has been a really great conversation. You got any closing words for the audience?
No, I think it's been a wonderful conversation, and I very much appreciate you engaging me on it, Dr. Hickok Slade.
Yeah, Dr. Shaki, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure.